Hello and welcome to Scottish Poetry and Slavery with guests Lisa Williams and Hannah Lavery. This special Book Week Scotland event has been brought to you by Scottish Book Trust. It is part of the Book Week Scotland 2020 Digital Festival. This event is intended as a watch-along walking tour. Your host, Lisa Williams, is an author and a poet. She is the founder of the Edinburgh Caribbean Association, which often runs Black History walking tours of Edinburgh. She has created a special literary focus walking tour just for Book Week Scotland. On her tour today is Hannah Lavery, an award-winning poet, playwright and performer. Both writers share anecdotes, information and poetic responses throughout. If you'd like to listen to a longer form, audio-only version of this tour, you can do so via the Book Week Scotland Conversations podcast, which can be found at scottishbooktrust.com. But without further ado, enjoy the tour.
So welcome to this event. We're doing a special Black History walking tour of Edinburgh, focusing on Scotland's role in slavery and the poems that Scottish poets wrote about it, pro-slavery and against it, and also bringing in some Caribbean poetry in responses to this history. Now, I'm absolutely thrilled to be with the legendary poet and playwright Hannah Lavery, and we're going to be going around some of these stops that we make normally on the history tour, but also weaving in some of Hannah's work and some of Hannah's poetry. So Hannah, thrilled to have you. And you know, you're an Edinburgh girl. You've walked these streets many times. I'm sure you've walked up and down the Royal Mile many a time. And I know in some of your work, you've made reference to particularly Scotland and slavery and sugar. And we're right here, we're standing outside Gordon's Trattoria, what is now Gordon's Trattoria. But in the old days, you know, with this quite unusual looking gold profile of one of the Gillespie brothers, James Gillespie, of course, as we know, made their fortune from slave-produced tobacco and snuff and had their tobacco shop here. But this was actually also a sugar shop back in the 18th century as well. It was called the St. Christopher's Sugar Shop, and they used to bring in sugar from Jamaica and from Antigua and what is now called St. Kitts, which was St. Christopher back in the day. And I was thinking also about one of your poems that made reference to this evil trade in bringing this slave-produced sugar into Scotland. And I was thinking particularly of your poem, Scotland, You're No Mine. And also what made you focus on that part of Scotland's history when you first started thinking about writing that poem?
I think sometimes with poems, images and words just sort of come and then you sort of retrace where they came from, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think when I was writing that poem, I'd been reading a lot and I'd been reading about the sugar trade and I just started to have this kind of flight of fancy around the idea that, you know, one of the things I really loved growing up was the macaroon bars, and just thinking about the way in which we have this sweet tooth and where that sweet tooth came from, and it just sort of it found its way into the poem, because the poem is talking about a kind of the hidden history, or the history which is part of who I am, and that feeling of not belonging, and about all the things that we don't acknowledge, we don't talk about, and how damaging that is and how that can be a dislocating experience. But the sugar was just, I think I absorbed that information and then it just found its way into the poem when I started thinking about where this kind of Scottish European sweet tooth, where we could follow that sweet tooth back to.
Exactly. And actually we can trace it back to 1670s if we're thinking about the Highlands. And in the Highlands, they used to import sugar directly from Suriname in South America. Wasn't even part of the British Empire. So even before 1707, Scots are getting involved in places like Suriname and actually bringing in sugar into the Highlands and exporting Highland horses all the way out to Suriname. So those folks up there were probably the ones with the first sweet tooth, actually. And then you see places like Glasgow in the 1690s, you see sugar refineries popping up. And then you see sugar refineries popping up in places like Edinburgh as well. So there were two down in Leith, for example, and there was one on the Royal Mile, which a lot of people don't know about. There's a place called Sugar House Close with a massive archway, which was big enough for the sugar carts to come in and out, bringing in their slave-produced sugar. And like I said, this place was the sugar shop. So when sugar became very fashionable, it became the thing to do, to have these teas and invite your ladies to tea, to have your sugary cakes and your sugar in your tea, which of course is then coming in from places like China and India. There's all sorts of records of these folks sending their servants down to this shop to bring these sugar loaves and sugar lumps back to the household. But would you like to read that poem, because it's so powerful?
So I'm going to read Scotland, You Know Mine. And before I do, I just wanted to give a content warning that there's some strong language in this poem. Okay, Scotland, You're No Mine. Scotland, you're no mine. You are no his, and I don't want you. So go ahead, say I don't belong. We a sepia tinge cross-eye, sweeping over all that swept away, blood-stained, sweat-stained, sugar for your tablet, your macaroon, you rotten, gobby, greedy, thieving, bastard you. Sitting atop all that shite and broken bones, weeping, poor me. Fuck you. I will dance jigs on your flags, blue, white and red, it doesn't matter, but your wee chancer. Fuck. For making us complicit, handing us whip and chains, an officer's coat, a civil service pen, a queen to love. And lay me out. I love you. With your mountain tying and all your currying, and you can say, I didn't belong to you. Go on. But I am a limpet stuck on you. So fuck you for no seeing one of your own. I will here. I will spill here. My blood and your secrets bleed into you, root and earth, and you forever pagan will in the spill and the seep see all you really are. So fuck you. My sweet, forgetful Caledonia will love. Fuck you.
Thank you, Hannah. When we're at this particular shop, I think it's important to remember particularly the women abolitionists who were involved in fighting against slavery. We're going to be talking about some of the Scottish poets who, interestingly, were much more radical and revolutionary than somebody like Robbie Burns, who is hailed as the progressive. And yet there's many other poets who at the very same time and even before were a lot more radical. We don't actually hear too much about those people. So, for example, there were so many women and also children, interestingly, who were adamantly against consuming any kind of slave-produced sugar, including somebody like Mary Somerville, who as a child refused to take sugar in her tea. And it was the same thing with her friends and the same thing with her cousins. There were a lot of children within households who were actually forcing the adults in the family not to consume sugar. So these are some of the heroes on this end who we don't hear about as well.
Mary Somerville, you said?
Yes, Mary Somerville, exactly, who was very close to one of Scotland's very influential abolitionists called Henry Brougham, who was born in St Andrew Square. And of course, we've got the controversial Melville Monument in the centre of St Andrew Square. His house where he was born on the corner, kind of Melville's basically looking down on the house where he was born. And he was a major abolitionist. So after this period when enslaved people are supposedly free in 1834, 1st of August, 1834, you're told that you're free, you can leave the plantation now, go and start a new life. Of course, only to be told, well, no, actually, you have to stay on the plantation that you've always stayed on and you're still not getting paid. But we're just going to call it something else. We're going to call it the apprenticeship period instead. And that was one of the only reasons how emancipation could go through. So Henry Brougham at that point is absolutely outraged. It gets to about 1837. They're trying to drag out this apprenticeship period for at least 10 years. And Henry Brougham is hearing all these reports coming in about how people are still getting mistreated so badly. And he takes a lot of flack in Parliament as an MP for trying to make sure that people are treated how they're supposed to be treated, and all this big fanfare about emancipation on this end, so many stories of Scottish abolitionists, Scots being disproportionately involved in the British Empire in all sorts of ways, like ships captains or land ownership or doctors coming out of the three main universities, things like that. But so many abolitionists as well who were fighting this end and really supporting the freedom fighters on the other end as well. Some of them were more moderate and some of them were very radical and actually calling for violent revolution on the plantations, and they were ministers in the Church of Scotland, for example. So it's a very complex story, and I think it's important for all of us to know this, because people come up with this ridiculous idea about taking a present lens and putting it on the past, and that's how it was then and we mustn't do that. And yet there were so many people at the time, black and white people, coming together, fighting together in working class revolutionary movements and so on. And I think if we know that history, it gives us a greater sense of strength and power for the kinds of things we could do now.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So let's wander up the Royal Mile a little to the Writers' Museum. Now, when I take people to the Writers' Museum, I talk about the fact that the museum used to be called Lady Stairs House, when it's part of, you come up through Lady Stairs Close. There was a boy who was referred to as Lady Stairs Black Boy in the 1740s, who was a personal servant of Lady Stair. And there were many servants around that area who would have been young people. You would see, at the very beginning of the 18th century, you would see advertisements for children for sale of African descent in the newspapers in Scotland. And often when those children grew up, it became very difficult. We were in a difficult position within the household. And that's when you see a lot of those adverts for so-called runaway slaves in the advertisements in Scotland, where people are trying to emancipate themselves. It's mostly men because it's easier for them to get away. The women tended to be inside the household. And of course, people are being rewarded for making sure that those people are taken back to the households where they're considered enslaved, even though by law at that point, actually, there is no slavery legally recognised in Scotland. So it's a complicated one. Thinking about Robbie Burns, who's one of those writers who is celebrated inside the Writers' Museum. And I'm sure growing up, you would have gone to many a Burns supper, probably had to learn Robbie Burns poetry at school. And I wonder for you, at what stage you found out about him trying to go to Jamaica, not going in the end, because of course we know his first book of poetry sold beyond that 9 guinea fare that he needed to go. And when you did find that out, did that change your perception of him and what he stood for? Do you remember how you felt at that point?
I didn't have a strong relationship with Burns. I think growing up in Edinburgh at that time, there wasn't a huge amount of Burns on my curriculum, to be honest. And I only discovered that relatively recently, within the last 3 or 4 years, I think, as recently as that. But yeah, I think for me, my discovery of those things was coming around the same time I was discovering, Scotland's connection with Jamaica, which is surprising because my family from Jamaica were the Douglases. So you think I would have at some point made that connection sooner, but it never kind of clicked with me until probably I was writing The Drift, actually. And then I started to do more research, and then I started to kind of really sort of revise my thinking and actually be aware of other people's thinking actually around Burns.
Yes. And you know what I think is probably, for me anyway, more interesting, not really that he didn't go to Jamaica, because, there were so many men in his position who would have done that or felt they had no choice for whatever reason. What's more interesting to me is the kind of people that he used to socialise with. So the kind of enslavers that he used to hang around with, like Robert Cunningham Graham of Gartmore, who was one of the most notorious ones, who actually boasts in his diary about the amount of children that he's had with enslaved women of all different colours, variegated complexions, as he says, he can't even keep track of them. And then he comes to Scotland, he brings 2 enslaved people, he and his wife with them. One he decides to sell because he says, his temperament's just not suited to Scotland, and he just decides to send it back to the colonies, sells them for £100, and then drinks that away in a whole big vat of Madeira wine. He ends up dying of gout eventually. Now, what's weird about this is that he becomes the rector of Glasgow University, and he's leaving his past behind and so on. And maybe he's good, maybe he's excellent at hiding his past. But it's strange because Robbie Burns' bookseller, Peter Hill, is married to a Jamaican. They're living with about 12 kids on the Royal Mile. She's actually the half-sister of Dido Bell, who, of course, we know, Britain's first mixed-race or black aristocrat, in that famous painting at Scone Palace. So she's got her half-sister living with Robbie Burns' bookseller, surely full of stories of Jamaica. He also is really close to this Robert Cunningham Graham of Gartmore. So in 1790, he writes this letter to Peter Hill, basically saying that Cunningham Graham of Gartmore is like the best man on earth, the man of the highest virtue, and so on and so on and so on. So either he didn't really care about what he'd done, or he didn't know, or maybe because his cousin was his patron at the time, he's kind of making sure that he's keeping in with the people who are keeping his career going. So for me, that is probably more interesting, the kind of company that he keeps. And what's also interesting is that some of the poets around the time are a lot more outspoken about slavery. It's very rare to hear him talking about it at all. Now, a lot of historians now, and even Burns historians, are saying it's very unlikely he wrote the Slave's Lament because of the kind of route between Senegal and Virginia that actually was closed to British at that particular point. So it doesn't quite fit. I think it's an older song that we're kind of revamping around that time, 1792. And actually, he doesn't really mention, he certainly doesn't mention the Haitian Revolution. We know that he loves the American and the French one, and he doesn't mention the Haitian one. And the only reference really to slave he talks about as a coward slave. So he doesn't really, he falls a bit short, really, when it comes to talking about anything like that. He kind of dodges it. There's this English poet called Helen Maria Williams, who's this really revolutionary, radical poet. Have you ever heard? Do you know about her?
No.
Oh, you must check her out. She's amazing, actually. Helen Maria Williams. And she and Burns have these letters going back and forth between them. And she's a real admirer of Burns. Her mother's Scottish. She grows up, just on the border. But she is very fervent against war, against colonialism, against slavery, against exploitation of indigenous people. She even gets jailed for her beliefs. That's how far she's willing to go. And I don't see Burns willing to go that far, in that kind of climate that Henry Melville had also been involved in creating this really fearful environment about speaking out, I'm going to read, if I may. I just love this poem because often when I do the tour and I talk about Burns, if I'm feeling poetic that day, I will read this lovely poem by Lorna Goodison, who's just stepped down as Poet Laureate of Jamaica. And this is actually dedicated to Asif Khan at the Scottish Poetry Library because they're close. And I had a wonderful lunch with her actually a few years back, and I would love to meet her again. It's amazing. So, and I hear from two Robbies, a poem by Lorna Goodison for Asif. Marley is on perpetual play in the earthen jar, where you pass as vegan to pick up his messages. Though the homeless of Ann Arbor are flown south on Greyhound, and you've sprung from storage your mothballed wool wardrobe. You have collected in your blood some 60 odd seasons of hot sun, solar sufficient for core heat. Keep your one heart warm, red Robbie messages. Pay for a meatless meal, return to the tower, find a postcard come in the mail from Scotland, stamped with a fine profile of Robbie Burns. Read, then rest on a fluted red glass vase, masked with red roses. Oh, Robbie, when pressure dropped, you all but booked passage to leave old Scotland. Pressed hard, you thought to take a bookkeeper job on a sugar estate, and no man's a good man for that. Your own book kept you in Scotland, where you became darling Macca, people's champion, precious national treasure, greatest son of Caledonia. Still, a man's a man for all that. And even if you pass on this chance to become rude boy poet Robbie Burns, boaster and toaster of Jamdown, oh, the girls would have loved you, mad over you. Bury by Robbie, hard man with a sweet mouth. Flow gently, sweet often, as you savour the scorch kiss of red Scotch bonnet, pepper and greens. So let it be. Come, all poets from murmuring steams, blue multiple mountain ranges, murmuring steams, banks, braes, rivers by the hundred, murmuring steams.
Wow.
Isn't it great?
That's wonderful.
The other poem I would love you to read is You Were Mine to Carry.
Okay.
And maybe before you read it, maybe just explain to us where the poem's from and how it also fits into your work in general.
This poem was part of my play and show, spoken word show, The Drifts, and also part of a pamphlet called Finding Sea Glass. So it's a poem about my father, and a poem about, you know, him as a Black man in Scotland and me as his daughter, and what the feeling of not belonging does. But there's a lot of references. My Scottish family tree lived, you know, in the Canongate and for as far back as we can discover. So there's lots of, there's kind of references to the closes, and so it feels quite apt to read it. So this is called You Were Mine to Carry. You were mine to carry with the burden you swaddled me in, the burden you handed to me with my rattle, the burden of that fucking rage, all that no belonging, all that you don't quite fit. A burden of their gaze we shared, but my skin was lighter. A limbo under the colour bar for me, an almost slip into nationhood for me. You pass as white for me. You couldn't. No, Dad. You're kidding yourself. In your Scotland top, clinging to the roots of your Scottish family tree, comic, grotesque, walking your father's long white line of working men huddled in the Edinburgh closes, and no matter how close they held you, or how prized, how loved the sun, this mother country made you fucking exotic, and whilst you fought that futile fight for something more, all that fine rage, that early brilliance, that packed punch, a waste. The only damage that you managed to inflict was inflicted on your wives, your children, on me, on you too. You see, we inherit our family's trauma, their degradation drops its way to us, their stories weave their way to us in Anansi's web, in knots, in helix, these ghosts we carry, broken bones on our backs. Dad, I will find you. I will unravel you for me. I will see you whole. I will turn you sea glass in my hands. Not just Daddy Monster. And you know that's a neat fit, but you wear it badly, and we, you and I, we know. Dad. Okay, I know. I know the real fucking monsters in our story.
Thank you, Hannah. And Parliament House, which of course on the Royal Mile, it's a nice place to sort of move off the Royal Mile to get a bit of peace and quiet. You don't hear the bagpipe. Not that I hate bagpipes, but you're not fighting to speak against the bagpipes that are by the David Hume statue. And of course, all of the controversy around David Hume's and his David Hume's racist ideas, which would have had a major effect in supporting slavery and colonialism, not just him, but the fact he was so influential. But every time I walk through into Parliament House, I think about Joseph Knight and how brave he would have had to have been in 1770s. Joseph Knight, brought from Jamaica by John Wedderburn, he's brought up to Ballandine, he falls in love with Annie Thompson, who's a white Scottish servant from Dundee, working in the household. And then they get married. And this is so key. The fact they actually come to Edinburgh, get married legally, and then they go back, she gets pregnant with the first child. And of course, he, just like any new dad, will want to be able to bring up and protect and support the family. So he asked to move out of service, maybe be somewhere on the grounds with her, and they're still going to work and they're going to have a family. And Wedderburn says at that point, no way. And he kicks her out of the household. So at that point, he's like, hang on a minute, I'm not getting paid. I need to have a salary. I should not be in perpetual service. Slavery isn't actually legal in Scotland. And that's how he's able to go and fight his case. Eventually, it's a long drawn out case. And by 1778, 8 out of those 12 judges say, you're absolutely right. There was a law back in 1701 that said you couldn't go and send people back to the colonies. So all this stuff that's been happening is actually really illegal, just because you're powerful, you know, people have been able to do it. And actually, going back from that period, it was fairly clear that slavery wasn't allowed on Scottish soil. So really what they're doing in that case, rather than just saying, right, we're abolishing slavery, as sometimes sort of lazy journalists will say in newspapers. Meanwhile, of course, chattel slavery is still happening in the Caribbean, with Scots being disproportionately involved in it. But after that, those adverts in those newspapers disappear, and he's managed to fight his case. It's made totally clear now that you cannot hold somebody in a household against their will, and all those adverts just disappear. So it's such a major case. And even thinking about John McLaren, who was one of the counsels for Joseph Knight. So weirdly, you've got Henry Dundas, who was a counsel for him, who was a hotshot lawyer at that point. That's why there's a statue of him also inside the Parliament building. You have John McLaren, who also is a poet, and he writes this poem in 1760 called The Walk, and this is a little piece from the poem. What woes, the slave trade even by generous Britons driven, ambition, avarice, and various ills, allowed to rage and ravish on earth, the whole creation groans. And then he writes a really scathing critique of when Dundas, Henry Melville, and Prime Minister Pitt, who's his good pal, and they get together and they send out the biggest military mission that has ever left Britain to try and secure Jamaica and go and reinstate chattel slavery in Haiti, where people have already freed themselves a couple of years later. And basically he writes this poem in 1796 when Melville is also in charge of making sure that all his governors, who are mainly Scottish, mainly his friends, are doing the most hideous things, hideous repression right across the Caribbean. 1796, he writes this poem called His Address to the Powers of War. And it's a furious poem. This is the kind of thing I wish Burns had written. And he's telling consumers also in Britain to forego the juice, whose costly and too common use maintains the monstrous trade. So he is railing against anyone using slave-produced sugar, but also furious about this war. And the fact that he and Dundas were counselled together for Joseph Knight in 1778, and a few years later, Dundas is now in these major positions in the British government and just wreaking havoc on the Caribbean. And the fact that he is, writing these poems, just saying this is outrageous. And when you look back at some of the Scottish Enlightenment figures who are writing poetry, one of the most outspoken ones, who I quite appreciate actually, of the Enlightenment scholars, who really has a go at Hume for saying that white people are superior to basically everyone else in the world. And he says, you're being ridiculous. And then Hume has to go and revise what he said because he realizes actually, I'm talking nonsense. James Beattie up in Aberdeen is probably one of the most radical of the Enlightenment scholars. He's a little bit frightened about speaking out because it might kind of ruin his career, but he gets more and more outspoken as his career goes on. And he also writes a poem in 1760 called The Triumph of Melancholy, where he says, will ye one transient ray of gladness dart, cross the dark cell where hopeless slavery lies. So again, even back in the Enlightenment period and before, on the early stages, you've got poets speaking out. But there's one more spot I'd like to take you to, which is where we normally end the tour, which is by the Darwin plaque on Lothian Street at the back of the National Museum. And a lot of people don't even know that that plaque is there. And they certainly don't know about the plaque that's now disappeared, which was just a few doors down. And this is the story of who was there. Now, Charles Darwin basically comes to Edinburgh. He's 16 years old. He is studying medicine, bored out of his mind, hates it, desperate to go back home, writing letters to his dad saying, can I come home now? I hate cutting up cadavers. I don't really want to do this. And he finds out about this man called John Edmonston, who's living a few doors down, who's teaching the students taxidermy for a guinea a lesson. He's like, great, I want to do that as well. So he gets together with John Edmonston, who was previously an enslaved man born into slavery in Guyana to a Scotsman on a timber plantation. And he's actually taught taxidermy when he's a young man. He comes over to Glasgow with the family in 1817, and he gets a job in the museum, actually selling all sorts of exotic specimens to the museum, stuff they've probably never seen before. Comes over to Edinburgh, does the same thing. He's selling all sorts of things like boa constrictor skins to the museum and exotic birds from South America and so on. Darwin ends up hiring him for about 2 months around his 17th birthday. And they develop this really good friendship. And he says he's a very pleasant man, he's a very intelligent man. And it may have influenced his, his beliefs on slavery. And of course, as we know later on, his ideas of race starts to harden a little bit. It gets, these, and of course the social Darwinists sort of jump on the bandwagon with some of his ideas that start to shift towards white superiority. But they think without the skills that he had from Edmundston, when he goes on to the SS Beagle and he figures out the theory of evolution, and he's drawing the birds with their beaks, he would not have been able to do it without the skills that he learned from John Edmundston, all about the knowledge of South America as well. So what I'd like to do is read this one poem by John Agard, legendary Guyanese poet, who actually has read this poem right at that spot in Edinburgh.
Wow.
It's called The Ascent of John Edmundston. My name rings no bell in the ears of science, but footnotes know me well. Footnotes where history shows its true colours, and passing reference is flesh. For I am John Edmundston, whose name is little known to evolution's white ladder, but Darwin will remember me. Just say the black man who taught him Egypt's ancient art of taxidermy. To think that we should meet in Edinburgh, of all places, few doors apart on Lothian Street. No mention then of savage races. In those days we were two bird stuffers, mounting mortality in feathers. We were each other's missing link, colleagues upright on the chain of being, a pair of wingless apes, condemned to think.
Oh, condemned to think, what a great line.
Condemned to think, yeah. So, yes, this is the end of the tour, but it's been wonderful to hear your work again. It always affects me differently each time. So thank you for sharing. And also just, it's been great to see how your work and the history all fits together. And I really wish that these kinds of conversations that we've been having this year can continue.
Me too, Lisa, and I've been wanting to do this tour with you for so long that I'm really glad that I finally got to join you on this, and it's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for the tour and the work you're doing. I'm really, really grateful to you for it.
Oh, you're welcome. So this Book Week Scotland event has been brought to you by Scottish Book Trust. Scottish Book Trust wants everyone living in Scotland to have equal access to books, because better access to books means better life chances. You can help by gifting a book to a family who's struggling this Christmas. If you've enjoyed this event, please consider sharing your love of reading with others by making a donation to Scottish Book Trust's Christmas Appeal at scottishbooktrust.com. Thank you.